As that video really pointed out, we really live in hopeless days. We live in a world where it just seems that every time we turn on the television that there is something else that just takes our hope away, just makes us look at the world and just think, could it possibly get any worse? And then, yes, it does. I mean, this past week, the terror attacks in London, even, I guess, over the weekend, a nightclub in Cincinnati, Ohio, where gunmen opened fire and took the lives of several people who were there. And our Congress and government that can't seem to figure out what to do in order to set our country on the right kind of track. And so we look around, and there are people all around us who are living their lives without any kind of hope. They're walking around in the darkness, and because they don't find anything real in life, they are just hopeless. But in spite of everything, in spite of what we see, in spite of what we experience, in spite of everything that we know around us, the biblical answer is for us to our eyes on the unseen, to place our hope in something that we cannot physically touch, but we know the power of the gospel. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. My hope is built on Jesus. He is the one great hope, and everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord, is according to what Paul said, everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. I want to thank the Currans for helping us out this morning and modeling what family worship might look like. And in the passage that Stacy read, the passage there in Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 13, Paul is making the case, and he's making it very explicitly, that Jesus is in fact the one great hope for Israel. As Israel is wandering around in the darkness of their existence, Jesus was in fact the light of salvation. And he was then, and he remains today, the one great hope of the world. We are just a couple of weeks away from Easter. It's just next Sunday, and the next Sunday will be Palm Sunday and then Easter. So we're 3 weeks away from Easter. And the closer that we get to Easter Sunday morning, the more the people that you encounter on an everyday basis, the people who are walking around in your sphere of influence, who are a part of your world, the closer we get to Easter, the more those folks are at least willing to consider the claims of the gospel. Now, they may not fully embrace the gospel, but they are at least willing to listen. And that's why we chose this time of the year for the 3-1-5-1 challenge. Pray for 3 lost friends or family members. Learn 1 gospel conversation. Be willing to invite 5 friends or family members to be a part of your Sunday school class. And share the gospel with at least 1 person between now and Easter. So the 3-1-5-1 challenge. Pray for 3 lost friends or family members. Learn 1 gospel conversation. Invite 5 friends or family members to be a part of your Sunday school class, and share the gospel with at least 1 person. It's the time of year where people are at least open to understanding that. So our call, the challenge for us, is to tell someone. Tell someone, because everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And Paul asks the question, how will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone telling them? And how is someone to tell them unless that someone has been sent? Church, understand this morning, you are being sent. You are being sent to tell someone about what Jesus has done in your life. Tell someone because you are sent to do that. In order for you and me to be able to embrace God's call for us to tell someone, we must first be confident in the gospel. Our faith must be more than just cultural Christianity. It must be more than just that thing that is a part of our lives on Sunday morning because, well, it's what we grew up doing. And on Sunday morning we get up and we go to church and we sit through a worship service and we sing and we hear a sermon and we close our eyes when it's time to pray. And we kind of do this thing Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. But our confidence must be based on something more than just a superficial knowledge of Jesus. Paul started this whole thing out in Romans chapter 1 by saying, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And the reason Paul was not ashamed of the gospel, the reason he was confident in the gospel, is because Paul's life had been radically changed by the gospel. And he had radically reordered his life around the claims of the gospel. And I know what many of us in the room are thinking this morning, because there are a lot of us in this room this morning who have been going to church since 9 months before we were born, right? I mean, that's my story. I've been going to church since 9 months before I was born. I was not a crack baby, but I had a drug problem when I was born. You understand what I'm saying? My mama drugged me to church since she was dragging me to church before she ever changed a diaper on me. And I grew up I went to church. If the doors were open, I was there. I was there on Sunday morning, most often on Sunday night. Back in those days, we did sunbeams and children's choirs on Monday afternoons. Not Wednesdays, but Mondays. So, man, I'm talking about, I was at the church all the time. I'll be 55 years old in 2.5 weeks. Did I just say that out loud? 55 years old in 2.5 weeks. I've been going to church a long time. In 30 of those years, I have been in full-time ministry. But I want you to understand this morning, just because I have gone to church all of those years, and just because I went to seminary and earned 2 degrees from a Baptist seminary, just because I devoted my life to teaching God's Word, that is no guarantee that my life has been radically changed and radically reorganized by the gospel. It is absolutely possible to hear the gospel, even to understand the gospel, without believing the gospel. Look at Israel. They heard the gospel without understanding the gospel. Look at verse 18. Paul asks the rhetorical question, and then he goes on and answers it himself. He says, have they not heard? And then he says, indeed, they have. They have heard the gospel. They have heard what the Lord has said. And then look at verse 19. He asks the question again with an implied negative response. He says, but I ask, we've already established they heard, but I ask, did Israel not understand? Indeed, they did not. They heard the gospel, but they did not understand the gospel. And even if they had understood it, it is also possible to understand the gospel, to have knowledge about the gospel, without believing it. Back in verse 16, Paul quotes a verse from Isaiah, which asks the question, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? Who has believed what he has heard from us? They've heard it. They may or may not have understood it, but who has believed it? Not just who's understood. That's a different word. He's not talking about knowledge here. He's not talking about affirming facts about Jesus. The question is, who has believed? In the Greek, that word believe is the same word that is often translated as faith. So he's asking, who has placed his faith in what he has heard from us? Who has placed his faith in the gospel message? Who has trusted the gospel? Jim Cymbala, the pastor of the Brooklyn Tabernacle, said it right. He said, God is not looking for smart people because he's the smart one. So God doesn't need smart people. He's already smart. All he wants are people simple enough to trust him. So it's not a matter of knowledge, it's a matter of trust. Paul said, who has believed what he has heard from us? Who has believed, who has trusted the gospel message? Now, look at the very first part of verse 16. Paul makes this statement. He says, they have not all obeyed the gospel. It's kind of a strange way to put it, But what Paul is doing here is he is lamenting the reality that there was almost universal rejection from the Jews. They had heard it. They may or may not have understood it, but they have rejected the message. They did not believe. They did not trust. Paul says that trust is expressed with obedience. They did not all obey the gospel. Confidence for us in the gospel. For you and for me to be confident in the gospel means that we have to do more than just hear the gospel, and we have to do more than just understand the gospel. It comes when we have heard it, when we have understood it, and when we have, to use Paul's word here, obeyed the gospel. That's when we can be confident in the gospel. And that kind of confidence, that gospel confidence, is what gives us stability. It gives us hope in uncertain days. So if you don't walk away from this entire series with anything else, I want you to be sure that you walk away at least with this. I pray that you will be confident in the gospel, because it is only through gospel confidence, only through the confidence of what Christ has done for us on the cross of Calvary, giving his life that we might have life, being raised from the dead to sit at the right hand of the Father, empowering us in our daily walk with him, knowing full well he is coming again. By the way, that is an announcement, not a suggestion, not a motion up for a vote. He is coming again, and he is going to call his church to be with him. That gives us hope. That's where our hope comes from. That's our confidence. So it is only those who are confident in the gospel who can then be truly bold in the way they live out their lives with the gospel. Understand what I just said. It is only those who are truly confident in the gospel who can be truly bold with the gospel. Boldness comes from our own experience with the gospel. A couple of weeks ago when I was out, Newly talked about gospel conversations as they arise from the way that we just kind of live our lives and interact with people on a regular basis. He used as his text 1 Peter, and in 1 Peter, basically the whole focus of that epistle is Peter talking to the early church about how to live as aliens in a strange world, how to live as foreigners in a foreign country. He basically says this world's not our home, it's not where we belong, and so we're kind of here, and we look around and we see things that don't make sense to us, and we wonder why the world can't get its act together, because the world is lost and we are aliens living in this world. But you and I have had an experience with the gospel. God has done something in our lives, and if we have been radically saved and radically changed, and we've seen God work in radical ways, then guess what? The result of that is that we can and will be bold, because boldness comes from our experience with the gospel. And you think about the life of the Apostle Paul. Here was a man who had some kind of experience, didn't he? I mean, from the beginning point of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, when there's that very dramatic moment where he is struck blind and he hears the voice of the Lord and he calls out, and God radically changes his life. And at that moment you would think, okay, that's pretty dramatic for him to have been saved in that kind of way. And so, sure, if I had that kind of dramatic salvation experience, that confidence that comes from knowing, man, Paul could point to the day that he gave his life to Christ, couldn't he? It was the day that he was struck blind, and the day that God did that work in his life. Paul knew exactly when that was. But that wasn't it. Paul had also seen the way God worked in his life, the way the gospel worked its way out in his life as Paul faced angry mobs. As Paul faced all kinds of horrible experiences, God saw him through all of that. He saw him through beatings and abandonment, and through everything, God was faithful. And a major part of Paul's understanding was his ability to look at everything that happened in his life and interpret that in the sense of, God, what are you doing? What is God's perspective on all of those things that are going on in my life? So everything that Paul faced taught him something about himself, and it taught him something about God and what God was doing in his life. Those of you who have lived a little while know exactly what I'm talking about. When you've been through the fire, when you have wrestled with life, and when you realize God's faithful, God is faithful, then you know by your own experience that it is absolutely, the gospel is absolutely 100% true. You know that in that moment you can trust the very heart of God. So boldness comes from our own experience with the gospel. But Paul points out something else in this passage that is vital for us to have a boldness with the gospel, and that is that boldness comes from our conviction that the gospel really is for everyone. I think I may have told y'all the story before about a conversation I had some 20 years or so ago. I was in another church, and after church, we were standing around the piano, and we were having a conversation about a family that had moved into our community at that time. And so we're having this conversation, and I'm trying to figure out who might have the best connection to this family so we can kind of sick them on that family, and maybe invite them and reach out to them and share the gospel with them and that kind of thing. And so we're having this conversation, and one of the participants in the conversation said this with an absolute straight face. "Preacher, I don't think they're church people." As if my response was supposed to be, "Oh, well, never mind then. They're not church people. We don't have to worry about them." We have to have the conviction that the gospel is for everyone. Remember, verse 13 boldly proclaims, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." For God so loved the world. He could have easily said, "For God so loved Israel," or "God so loved church people." But he didn't. He said, "God so loved the world." Jews, Gentiles, saints, sinners, church people and non-church people. Peter put it like this: the Lord is not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Folks, unless you are convicted that the gospel is really for everyone, then you will not be bold in your witness. But if you are confident in the gospel, and you are convicted that the gospel is for everyone, you will be bold with the gospel. Those who truly believe that my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness will be bold with the gospel. Former SBC President James Merritt tweeted this past week, he said, "When we have real passion for the gospel, we will have heartfelt compassion for people who need the gospel." Boldness with the gospel comes from confidence in the gospel. The statistics show that the 21st century church has very little boldness with the gospel. We have very little passion for the gospel. Just this past summer, June 8th of 2016, there was a headline that put it in alarming terms. It said, "Free fall continues in SBC membership and baptism stats." And then it went on to say, baptisms long regarded as a benchmark for denominational health dropped by 10,000. It was the 8th decline in the last 10 years. And the smallest total since 1947. We have little to no boldness with the gospel. Could it be that our lack of boldness with the gospel comes from our lack of confidence in the gospel? Could it be that we have fixed our hope on something other than Jesus? Romans chapter 10, verse 21, God says, "All day long have I reached out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people." God was holding out his hand to Israel. But catch this. they wouldn't turn loose of their religion in order to take hold of God's hand. Oh, how I hope that will never be said of us. Just because we have been in church forever, may it never be said of us that God was holding out his hand to us with the gospel, but we refused to take it. It's kind of like being in a precarious, life-threatening sort of situation. Kind of like you're stuck out on a limb somewhere, and you're holding on for dear life, and God is standing back at the trunk of the tree, and he's saying, just turn loose and take my hand, I've got you. But you're like, no, I got this limb, and I'm hanging on to this limb, and I'm not turning loose for anything in the world. I am holding on right here. And God says, trust me, just turn loose. Just turn loose. Just turn loose and trust me. See, obedience is required. There comes that moment when we have to be willing to turn loose and take hold of the hand of God. We have to turn loose of our idols. We have to turn loose of our sin. We have to turn loose in order to take hold. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. This old world can look pretty hopeless. There are a lot of people who want to put their hope in a lot of things, but there is one great hope, and his name is Jesus. So the question is, do you know him? There is one great hope, and his name is Jesus. Do you know him? You can. You can. This morning, he is reaching out to where you are. He's reaching out to you right now. He's holding out his hand, reaching out and saying, just turn loose and take my hand. Turn loose of whatever it is. Admit that you are a sinner. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Admit you're a sinner. Admit it. Turn loose. Believe in Jesus. Trust him enough that you're willing to turn loose and take hold. And then confess that Jesus is Lord. Declare your allegiance to him. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. Would you join me as we pray?